Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to travel far back in time, to a city so dazzling, so unbelievable in its splendor, that even the most stubborn historians admit yes, Babylon was the crown jewel of the ancient world. Picture this, towering, walls painted in deep blue glaze, shining with golden lions and dragons, gardens so lush they seemed to float above the ground, and streets humming with traders, scribes, and priests, each convinced they lived at the very center of civilization. Babylon was not just a city, it was a statement, and like every bold statement, it made plenty of enemies. Now, fair warning, if you're lying in bed thinking this is going to be a gentle stroll through flower gardens, you may not survive. Don't worry, though I'll be gentle, and the history lesson comes with a few laughs, so maybe you'll nod off somewhere between the massive temple of Marduk and the guy selling suspicious date wine on the corner. But before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here, no pressure. And if you feel like sharing, drop a comment with your location and the time right now. It's always fun to see where in the world people are listening from. Maybe Babylon itself is tuning in. Unlikely, but hey, stranger things have happened. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. At its height, Babylon gleamed under the hot Mesopotamian sun like a jewel set in the desert. Travelers crossing endless sands found themselves stunned when the city rose before them, an apparition of walls, towers, and shining gates. Some said the Ishtar Gate, with its rows of golden bulls and lions, was so beautiful that poets forgot their verses mid-sentence. Others swore the Hanging Gardens, one of the seven wonders, were built to remind a queen of her green homeland. Historians still debate whether those gardens truly existed or were just a dazzling story to impress visitors. Either way, Babylon knew how to market itself. The Euphrates River ran through its heart, shimmering in the daylight, lined with boats carrying grain, dates, and exotic goods from distant lands. Fishermen cast nets, while merchants shouted prices. And somewhere in the chaos, a priest probably muttered that too much noise angered the gods. Yet commerce thrived, and with it came languages, cultures, and foods that turned Babylon into the ancient world's equivalent of a trendy fusion restaurant. Of course, what impressed outsiders most was not the food stalls or the exotic perfumes, it was the walls. Babylon's fortifications were said to stretch so high and so wide that chariots could ride along their tops. Some exaggerated, saying the walls touched the sky. The truth, probably less dramatic, but still intimidating enough, that invaders usually thought twice. The Babylonians loved reminding everyone, our walls cannot be breached, as history would later prove. Saying that out loud was perhaps a tactical mistake. Life inside the city was a mixture of grandeur and everyday struggle. In the shadow of the ziggurat, scribes scribbled furiously on clay tablets, recording laws, taxes, and gossip disguised as official business. Artisans carved intricate seals, while children played in dusty courtyards. Somewhere in a tucked-away workshop, a brewer experimented with beer recipes, because apparently, even in ancient Babylon, someone was trying to invent the perfect weekend drink. But what really set Babylon apart was its aura of destiny. Citizens walked its streets believing they were part of something eternal. Temples rose like stairways to the heavens, decorated with colorful tiles that gleamed in the sun. At night, priests watched the skies, charting stars and predicting futures. Astrology may feel like a modern trend, but Babylonians took it far more seriously. A misplaced star or a strange alignment could send shivers through the city, convincing people that doom or victory was around the corner. Sometimes it was just a comet. Sometimes it was a conquering army. Even travelers who disliked Babylon could not help but admire its confidence. Imagine being a nomadic trader arriving from a dusty caravan route, stepping inside those monumental gates, and realizing your tent and goat back home would never measure up. That kind of intimidation was deliberate. Babylon was not shy. Babylon said, "Look at me. I am the center of the world. Try to top this." Of course, this confidence carried with it a pinch of arrogance. And arrogance, as every bedtime story reminds us, has a tendency to invite trouble. Somewhere beyond the horizon, people were watching Babylon with interest, calculating, scheming, and wondering how to bring down a city that claimed it could never fall. One of them, as fate would have it, was a man named Cyrus, a name that Babylon would eventually never forget. But for now, In these opening moments, Babylon stood tall, glittering in the desert light. Musicians strummed their lyres in the evening breeze, priests tended their sacred fires, and storytellers wove tales of gods and kings. The people slept securely inside their mighty walls, believing tomorrow would always be just as bright as today. Historians still debate whether they truly saw the cracks forming, or whether comfort blinded them to what was coming. So, let's tuck that image into your mind, a city of unmatched glory, proud and prosperous, a place where laughter and hubris echoed through marble halls. Because in the chapters ahead, you'll see how even the brightest jewel can lose its shine. And maybe, just maybe, it'll remind us not to brag too much about our own walls, digital or otherwise. At the peak of its glory, the Neo-Babylonian Empire stretched wide across Mesopotamia, glittering with wealth and towering over its neighbors like a colossus of brick and gold. The city of Babylon itself was not just the crown jewel, it was the beating heart. Merchants arrived from faraway lands, their camels weighed down with spices, ivory, and brightly woven textiles. Scribes scratched furiously on clay tablets, recording every sale, every loan, every whispered argument about whose sheep wandered into whose garden. And through it all, the people of Babylon carried themselves with the confidence of those who believed their empire was eternal. Much of that confidence came from the legacy of Nebuchadnezzar II, the king whose name has survived through centuries of storytelling. He was the builder, the warrior, the man who expanded the empire and left behind palaces that gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun. When travelers saw the Ishtar Gate and its brilliant glazed bricks, they were not just impressed, they were intimidated. Imagine being a weary trader from the desert, only to find yourself staring up at lions and dragons, sculpted in gold, roaring silently from the walls. It was less welcome to our city, and more don't even think about starting trouble. But empires, no matter how dazzling, have a way of showing cracks. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, his successors faced the same old challenges: too many rivals, too many temptations, and too much palace intrigue. Some kings lasted only months before being overthrown, poisoned, or if they were lucky, politely retired to a quiet villa far away from power. Historians still debate whether one particular short-lived king was removed for incompetence, corruption, or simply having a face people didn't like. Babylonian politics was not for the faint of heart. Still, the empire endured, at least on the surface. The city bustled, priests kept their temples burning with sacred fires, and merchants stacked their stalls with colorful goods. But beneath the hum of prosperity, unease simmered. Too many coups, too many whispers, and too much arrogance had a way of gnawing at the foundation. It was a bit like a beautiful palace that looked perfect from the outside, but inside, termites were quietly having a feast. One strange detail stands out in this period. The Babylonians had a habit of naming years after important events, instead of simply counting them. One year might be the year the king built the Great Canal, while another might be the year the Elamite army caused trouble again. There was even one year named after a lunar eclipse, so terrifying that people refused to leave their homes for days. Can you imagine explaining that at the office? Sorry boss, can't work, today's the year of the spooky moon. Meanwhile, Babylon's leaders kept themselves busy with rituals, feasts, and occasionally ill-advised displays of arrogance. King Nabonidus, for example, earned a reputation for being more interested in moon gods than in running his empire. Priests grumbled, citizens complained, and generals wondered why the king was off meditating in the desert instead of keeping an eye on Persia, which was rapidly growing stronger. If Twitter had existed back then, Nabonidus would have been trending for all the wrong reasons. The Babylonians still believed their city was invincible. Their walls were unmatched, their river brought prosperity, and their gods surely favored them. Yet history tells us confidence is often the appetizer before disaster. Beyond the eastern horizon, Cyrus of Persia was building something far more dangerous than a collection of temples. He was building an empire of his own. Inside Babylon, though, daily life continued with its rhythms. Families shared flatbread and dates, children learned to write cuneiform on clay, and soldiers patrolled the gates. On the surface, everything seemed calm. But when too many rulers rise and fall too quickly, when priests argue with kings, and when people whisper that omens are being ignored, you can sense the tremor beneath the ground. Something was coming. The empire might still have been at its height, but the height is always the closest point to the fall. Of course, no one in Babylon said that out loud. Instead, they lifted their cups of date wine, toasted to their glorious city, and proclaimed, "Babylon will stand forever." And in the distance, perhaps a Persian scout smiled quietly and took notes, while Babylon's palace halls echoed with feasting and backroom plotting. Far beyond its walls, a new force was rising in the east. In the rugged landscapes of Persia, Cyrus the Great was carefully building something that would eventually eclipse the grandeur of Mesopotamia itself. He didn't just inherit a kingdom, he shaped it, hammering it together like a blacksmith forging a blade. With patience, heat, and a vision few could see at the time. Cyrus was not the kind of ruler content to merely sit on a throne and issue decrees. He was a commander who rode with his soldiers, ate their rations, and shared their hardships. That sort of thing works wonders for loyalty. It's a lot harder to betray someone when they've already trudged through mud beside you. He united the fractious tribes of Persia, convincing them that they were not just scattered clans, but a people destined for greatness. If Babylon's rulers were busy quarreling over omens, Cyrus was busy making history. One of his great innovations wasn't about swords or spears, but about how to treat conquered peoples, rather than crushing them. Under the heel of oppression, he often allowed them to keep their traditions, religions, and even some local rulers. That may sound like basic decency today, but in the 6th century BCE it was revolutionary. Imagine conquering a kingdom and then saying, "Oh, you can keep your gods, don't worry." His policies created an empire not just built on fear, but on cooperation though, of course. Fear played its part to dot an odd but fascinating detail. According to some records, Cyrus was so respected that even his enemies sometimes admired him more than their own leaders. Think about that. When your conqueror is more popular than your king, you know something's gone wrong in your palace. Historians still debate whether this was genuine admiration or just clever propaganda, but either way, it worked. The Persians' rise was not just about military power, it was about timing. While Babylon wavered in palace intrigue, Cyrus struck alliances with groups tired of Babylonian dominance. Some were eager for liberation, others just wanted a new boss who didn't micromanage their daily lives. It turns out that letting people practice their religion and not raising taxes too high can make you very popular. Perhaps modern leaders should take note as Cyrus's empire expanded. Merchants, artisans, and soldiers all benefited from the increasing stability. Trade routes opened, connecting distant corners of the empire. Exotic goods began to circulate: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, spices from India. To a Babylonian merchant, it must have seemed exciting and, perhaps just a little ominous that so much prosperity flowed under a Persian banner. Back in Babylon, the whispers grew louder. Priests muttered that the gods were favoring Persia now. Soldiers grumbled about unpaid wages. Even among the nobles, some secretly wondered whether Cyrus might actually make a better overlord than their own king. And here's the twist. Sometimes empires fall not because of an external blow, but because people inside secretly hope for change. But for the moment, Babylon stood secure behind its mighty walls, confident in its invincibility. Cyrus, however, was patient. He knew walls could be broken, not always with battering rams, but with cunning and timing. Still, the Babylonians were not entirely blind to his rise. They sent envoys, weighed alliances, and staged grand rituals to reassure themselves of divine favor. Yet each ritual, each feast, each decree felt more desperate, like a singer trying to hit a note already slipping out of range. The grandeur of Babylon glittered as brightly as ever, but in the distance, the drums of Persia were beginning to beat, steady and unstoppable. Inside the glittering palaces of Babylon, where golden lions guarded the doors and servants scurried through marble corridors, ambition and intrigue ruled as surely as the kings themselves. After Nebuchadnezzar's monumental reign, the throne became something of a revolving chair, occupied, vacated, and reclaimed in dizzying succession. Each new king tried to assert power, but behind the embroidered curtains, advisors whispered, generals plotted, and priests murmured about omens they claimed the rulers ignored. Some of these monarchs lasted only a year. One poor fellow was dethroned so fast that he barely had time to stamp his name on a clay tablet before being shown the palace exit. Historians still debate whether he was truly incompetent or simply caught in the wrong factional squabble at the wrong time. Either way, he probably wished he'd pursued a safer career, like baking bread or teaching astrology. At least no one assassinated the bakers. It wasn't just politics, it was the sheer intensity of palace life. Court banquets could turn from toasts to treachery in the time it takes to finish a goblet of pomegranate wine. Generals eyed one another with suspicion. Scribes kept secret records that were not so secret. And family members quietly asked themselves whether poisoning Uncle Nabonidus might be easier than waiting for him to retire. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as though the very bricks of the palace had absorbed centuries of ambition and betrayal. One curious tradition of the Babylonian court involved elaborate rituals to cleanse the king of guilt. In some ceremonies, a substitute king was appointed to bear the bad omens of an eclipse or an ill-starred prophecy. The unfortunate stand-in would rule briefly, while the real king waited it out in hiding. When the bad omens passed well, let's just say the substitute didn't exactly retire with honors. It sounds absurd now, but for the Babylonians, cosmic order was no laughing matter. Still, one has to wonder if the substitute king idea was simply a clever way for nervous monarchs to take a vacation. Meanwhile, the common people looked on in a mixture of awe and exasperation. For the average farmer bringing barley to market, it probably mattered little who sat on the throne, as long as taxes stayed predictable and the river kept flowing. But even ordinary citizens could sense the instability. Rumors rippled through the city like a restless wind. Some whispered that the gods had grown weary of the royal squabbles. Others claimed that distant powers were watching and waiting. Perhaps both were true. The priests, ever attuned to omens, grew louder in their warnings. They pointed to eclipses, to strange movements of the stars, to floods and droughts. Were these signs of divine displeasure? Historians still debate whether such celestial events coincided conveniently with political crises, or whether the crises were conveniently timed to the stars. Either way, in Babylon, heaven and earth were always intertwined, and rulers ignored the priests at their peril. And so the stage was set, a city outwardly magnificent but inwardly divided. Powerful walls and temples could not mask the fragility of leadership, nor could rituals silence the whispers of conspiracy. Within the palace halls, shadows lengthened, not only from the oil lamps, but from the growing sense that Babylon's destiny might already be shifting. Yet the king still boasted, the nobles still feasted, and the city still gleamed. Life went on as if nothing could possibly threaten the empire. But beyond those towering walls, Cyrus of Persia was already sharpening not just his swords, but his strategies. By the time Cyrus's banners fluttered on the horizon, Babylon had entered what might be called its golden twilight, a city dazzling on the outside, but beginning to fray at the edges within. Babylon under King Nabonidus was a peculiar place, one that often left both subjects and priests scratching their heads. Nabonidus was not your run-of-the-mill monarch. He had peculiar habits, curious priorities, and, as some historians whisper, a knack for alienating exactly the people he needed most. Nabonidus had an obsession with the moon god Sin. That doesn't sound strange until you realize he often elevated Sin above Marduk, Babylon's traditional chief deity. Imagine running a company and suddenly announcing that the intern is now the CEO. It would ruffle feathers, and ruffle they did. Priests of Marduk were furious, and ordinary citizens felt uneasy when the rituals that kept cosmic balance were suddenly disrupted. After all, in their worldview, neglecting the right gods meant inviting chaos, famine, or, worse, military disaster. Not exactly the kind of thing you want in your divine resume. And then there was Nabonidus's peculiar retreat. For years, he abandoned Babylon altogether, moving to the desert city of Tamar in Arabia. The reasons remain mysterious. Some say he wanted to be closer to Sin's main temple. Others believe he was dodging political turmoil in Babylon. Historians still debate whether he simply got tired of the city or whether he saw a spiritual calling. Either way, the capital was left in the hands of his son Belshazzar, and Belshazzar, as fate would show, wasn't exactly the model of good governance. Belshazzar liked lavish banquets, heavy drinking, and theatrical displays of power. On paper, that might sound like the perfect resume for a party planner, but less so for a ruler expected to keep an empire steady. The people remembered his excesses vividly, especially a fateful feast where sacred vessels looted from Jerusalem were used like common cups. It was a scandal that shocked priests and left many whispering that divine judgment was on its way. Superstition was strong, and such omens weighed heavily on a society convinced that gods kept score. Meanwhile, Babylon itself remained a marvel of engineering and culture. The massive double walls, the legendary Ishtar Gate, and the gleaming temples still awed travelers. Merchants thronged the bazaars, selling everything from grain to ivory, while scribes recorded transactions in careful cuneiform. On festival days the processional way gleamed with color and music. Outsiders might have thought Babylon unshakable, yet beneath the surface, cracks ran deep. One odd detail that survives in some records is Nabonidus's interest in archaeology. Yes, you heard that right. Long before modern museums, Nabonidus was excavating ancient temples and restoring inscriptions from kings long dead. Imagine ruling the most powerful city on earth and deciding, you know what, let's go dig up old bricks. Admirable perhaps, but not very practical, when Persia was sharpening its swords, and Persia was indeed sharpening. While Babylon's leadership dabbled in moon worship and desert retreats, Cyrus kept his armies disciplined and his policies pragmatic. His growing empire began to encircle Babylon, absorbing allies and intimidating rivals. Some Babylonian generals must have looked nervously at maps, realizing their splendid city was slowly becoming an island in a Persian sea. But still, pride ran deep. The Babylonians trusted their walls, their rivers, and their gods, or at least the gods Nabonidus hadn't defended. They laughed at the idea of any army breaching their defenses. And, to be fair, who could blame them? The Euphrates flowed through the city itself, ensuring water and supplies. The walls were so thick, chariots could ride atop them. To outsiders, Babylon seemed unassailable, and yet, it is often at the moment of greatest confidence that fate turns. Nabonidus's neglect, Belshazzar's arrogance, the priest's anger, the people's uneasel. These threads were weaving a tapestry that Cyrus was ready to tear apart. The Persians didn't just bring swords. They brought patience, strategy, and the ability to turn Babylon's own divisions against it. For now, though Babylon still glittered, like a jewel about to slip from its setting, the feasts continued, the markets bustled, and the great city basked in its own grandeur, unaware that its twilight was deepening into night. When Cyrus finally set his eyes firmly on Babylon, he knew brute force alone would not do. A city with walls so wide that 4 chariots could ride abreast, with gates of bronze and rivers running through its heart, was not the kind of place you just knock on and hope they open. If Persia was going to conquer Babylon, it would require patience, ingenuity, and just a touch of psychological warfare. First came the alliances. Cyrus understood that empires rarely fall from a single blow. They collapse because their neighbors, allies, and even their own people stop believing in them. So, one by one, he courted the peoples under Babylon's shadow. Some he won with promises, others with threats, and still others with the promise of religious tolerance. Word spread, the Persians were not like the Babylonians. They didn't demand endless sacrifices or meddle with local gods. They let you worship freely, so long as you paid your taxes and stayed loyal. It was the kind of deal that looked very attractive when compared to the heavy hand of Babylon. Inside the city, rumors began to stir. Messengers whispered of towns falling to Cyrus without bloodshed. Farmers spoke of Persian patrols who actually paid for supplies instead of looting them. Traders carried tales that Cyrus had freed captive peoples, allowing them to return home and rebuild their temples. For the average Babylonian, that sort of talk was confusing and unsettling. It's a bit like realizing your neighbor's new boss is both kinder and more efficient than yours. It makes you start asking uncomfortable questions. Meanwhile, Cyrus' army moved with precision. He had seasoned cavalry, archers who could rain arrows like storms, and engineers who knew how to turn rivers into weapons. The Persians did not rely on sheer size alone. They relied on strategy, and one of those strategies was simple: cut Babylon off. They slowly strangled the city by controlling outlying regions, capturing smaller towns, and isolating the jewel from its crown. An odd yet telling anecdote emerges here. Some sources claim Cyrus's troops would chant about Babylon's arrogance as they marched, mocking the city's invincible reputation. Imagine thousands of soldiers turning your boast into a battlefield joke. It must have stung. Historians still debate whether these chants were spontaneous or orchestrated propaganda, but either way, they spread. And once confidence begins to crack, it doesn't take long for the fissures to widen. Back in Babylon, Belshazzar responded in the only way he knew how. With more feasts, grand banquets rolled on, where the city's elite drowned their anxieties. In wine and music, one can picture the laughter echoing through gilded halls, while beyond the walls, Persian scouts tightened their grip. It's the ancient version of ignoring your credit card bills by buying another round of drinks, fun in the moment, disastrous in the long run. Cyrus, however, was not in a rush. He camped near the city, studying it, watching, waiting for the perfect chance. His men dug trenches, redirected streams, and gathered intelligence from defectors. Babylon's might was not in its army was scattered, demoralized, and led by men more interested in ritual than strategy. Its might was in those walls, and Cyrus was already thinking of ways to make them irrelevant. The priests, meanwhile, were caught in a dilemma. They had lost faith in Nabonidus, who had angered them with his obsession with the moon god. Some quietly shifted their prayers toward Cyrus, convinced he might be the chosen one of Marduk himself. A conqueror who promised to honor their temples was far more appealing than a king who ignored their rituals. The spiritual balance of Babylon was tipping, and no feast, however lavish, could fix it. From the Persian side, every delay made sense. Supply lines strengthened, morale stayed high, and allies continued to defect from Babylon's weakening grasp. And all the while, the city behind those mighty walls grew more restless, more divided, and more vulnerable to exactly the kind of strike Cyrus specialized in. The stage was set, a city swollen with pride, a king distracted by divine obsessions, a son blinded by indulgence, and an enemy who was both patient and clever. The great confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but of when, and Cyrus, like a hunter circling wounded prey, was content to wait until the moment was perfect. The night Babylon remembers best, perhaps the night Babylon wishes it could forget, came during one of Belshazzar's infamous feasts. It was no ordinary dinner party. This was a spectacle, a grand performance designed to show that, despite Persian armies camped outside, the city remained unconquered and unboarded. The banquet hall gleamed with torchlight, reflecting off polished bronze and gold. Musicians played flutes and lyres, dancers swirled in brightly colored robes, and tables groaned beneath platters of roasted lamb, figs, and honey cakes. Wine flowed like a river, poured from golden pitchers into goblets, so heavy they required 2 hands to lift. In the corner, scribes carefully recorded attendance and gifts, because even decadence had to be accounted for in Babylon. Belshazzar sat high at the center, crowned with jewels, his face already flushed from drink. He wanted his nobles to see confidence, to believe that walls and rivers kept them safe. Yet the louder the music, the more it felt like he was trying to drown out whispers of Cyrus's steady advance. Then came the scandalous moment that made the evening infamous. Belshazzar, perhaps emboldened by too much wine or simply reckless by nature, ordered that sacred vessels looted long ago from Jerusalem's temple be brought into the feast. These were not ordinary cups. They were relics, holy items taken by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier. And here, in this glittering hall, Belshazzar raised one high in a toast, laughing as if to mock both gods and men. Gasps filled the room. Priests exchanged uneasy glances. Even hardened nobles shifted in their seats. You could almost hear the collective thought, "This is not going to end well." Historians still debate whether Belshazzar intended blasphemy or simply drunken showmanship. But either way, the moment stuck like a stain, and then the scene that would echo in legends, the mysterious writing on the wall. In the middle of the revelry, a hand appeared, just a hand tracing glowing words across the plaster. Silence fell, broken only by the flickering of torches. No one understood the inscription, but everyone felt the dread. The music faltered, goblets froze mid-air, and Belshazzar's confident grin collapsed into pale terror. It's worth noting that some scholars wonder if this was less supernatural and more political theater, perhaps engineered by priests eager to prove their point. Still, whether divine omen or clever trick, the effect was the same. Belshazzar trembled, his knees, one text says, knocked together. Nobles whispered of doom. And somewhere outside those walls, Persian scouts probably smiled at their good fortune. For a moment, the feast became chaos. Courtiers rushed to interpret the writing, promising explanations in exchange for rewards. But none could. It was as if the message mocked them, taunting Babylon with its own helplessness. And though history may have embellished the scene, what mattered was the shift in mood. from triumph to fear, from laughter to silence. An odd aside, some sources claim the palace kitchen dogs began howling at the same time, a detail so strange it feels like a storyteller's flourish. But odd details matter. They paint the picture of a night where everything felt uncanny, like the city itself sensed the end drawing near. Yet the feast did not stop immediately. Wine still flowed, perhaps more desperately now, as if drinking could wash away the omen. Belshazzar tried to rally his guests, declaring that Babylon's walls were invincible, that the Persians could not breach them, but words felt hollow against the flickering writing on the wall. The nobles saw fear in their king's eyes, and once fear shows itself, it spreads faster than fire, and so the great feast of Babylon, meant to prove strength, instead revealed weakness. What should have been a display of unity became a symbol of arrogance and impending doom. Outside, the Persians waited patiently. Inside, the Babylonians were already haunted by visions of their own downfall. As the glow of the feast's torches died down, and the writing on the wall lingered in memory, Babylon staggered into a new kind of unease. The people who had once believed their city could never fall now began to whisper in markets and courtyards. Rumors ran faster than the Euphrates itself. Persia was near, the gods were angry, and the king had lost their favor. In a society built on divine legitimacy, that was a dangerous cocktail. Cyrus, of course, was aware of the city's fraying confidence. His scouts and spies slipped through the countryside, gathering whispers like merchants collecting spices. The Persians were not simply warriors, they were strategists who thrived on psychology as much as steel, and Babylon was giving them plenty to work with. Inside the city, priests of Marduk debated how far they could tolerate Nabonidus's neglect. His obsession with the moon god's sin had already alienated them. When Belshazzar insulted sacred vessels at the feast, it was more than blasphemy, it was confirmation that their rulers had lost their spiritual compass. Some priests, historians suggest, began to quietly lean toward Cyrus, believing he might be the tool of Marduk himself to set things right. Meanwhile, the common people carried on with their daily lives, though anxiety crept into every transaction. Bakers baked, scribes etched contracts, merchants sold grain, but conversation always circled back to Persia. Mothers hushed their children, fathers muttered about omens, and soldiers grumbled over pay that never seemed to arrive on time. Babylon still bustled, but the hum of commerce was underscored by unease, like a song played half a note flat. One odd but telling story claims that in these days, some Babylonians began placing charms carved with images of lions or winged bulls near their doors, hoping to ward off Persian intrusion. Whether they worked or not is beside the point. What matters is that even in the shadow of colossal walls, people still sought magical insurance. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread practice or a later embellishment, but it captures the mood, fear wrapped in superstition. Cyrus exploited all of this. He let defectors spread tales of his generosity. He let traders carry stories of how he honored local gods in conquered lands. The picture painted was not of a barbarian horde, but of a liberator. To a weary Babylonian, it was a tempting narrative. Maybe life under Persia wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would even be better. But the city's rulers clung to denial. Nabonidus, from his desert retreat, continued to perform religious rites. For sin, Belshazzar doubled down on bravado, insisting that Babylon's walls and rivers guaranteed safety. And the nobles, caught between fear of Persia and loyalty to the throne, mostly chose silence. History shows that silence is rarely a winning strategy. Meanwhile, the Persians tightened their grip. They captured nearby towns, cut supply lines, and stationed troops at strategic points. Step by step, they turned Babylon from a sprawling empire into an isolated fortress. It was the ancient equivalent of being left out of a group, chattily with more spears involved. The writing on the wall had not only frightened courtiers, it had also emboldened the Persians. They knew fear was a weapon, and Babylon was now wielding it against itself. Each night inside the city was quieter, each festival less joyful, each omen more ominous. It was as if Babylon was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. And Cyrus, patient as ever, was happy to wait. He had no need to storm walls when doubt was already storming hearts. He could afford to bide his time until the great city crumbled from within. By the time the Persians encircled Babylon, the city's people lived in a strange contradiction. The walls loomed higher than ever, reassuring in their sheer bulk. Yet everyone knew the enemy was out there, watching, waiting. Life went on, markets bustled, marriages were celebrated. Scribes still pressed styluses into wet clay, but all of it carried a nervous undertone. It was like celebrating your birthday while someone taps ominously on your front door. Cyrus had no interest in battering those walls. Why waste men and time when patience and water could do the work? The Euphrates, which ran directly through Babylon, was both its lifeline and its Achilles heel. The Persians began diverting its flow, digging trenches and canals, slowly lowering the river's level. The Babylonians watched, puzzled at first, then alarmed as their moat-like advantage began to shrink. But surely, they reassured themselves, no one could march an army through a riverbed. Inside, Belshazzar tried to rally spirits with another round of grand declarations. He ordered torchlit patrols along the walls and sent out speeches promising that the gods still favored Babylon. But soldiers grumbled that words did not fill empty purses, and priests muttered that Marduk seemed unusually quiet these days. Historians still debate whether Belshazzar genuinely believed in Babylon's invincibility or whether he was just trying to convince himself. Either way, confidence wore thinner each day. Oddly enough, some texts suggest that in the midst of this tension, Babylonian astrologers claimed to see strange patterns in the stars. One report insists that an unusually bright comet streaked across the sky, taken as a sign that cosmic order was shifting. Was it real or a later embellishment? Hard to say. But the story captures the mood. People were looking upward for answers, because the ground beneath them felt unstable. Meanwhile, Cyrus's men quietly finished their work. Canals bled the Euphrates into marshes, and the once mighty river sank lower and lower. At night, Persian scouts crept along its banks, testing the depth, waiting for the moment it could be crossed. Babylon's walls were still unbroken, its gates still barred, but its shield was cracking invisibly from underneath. Daily life inside the city seemed almost surreal against this backdrop. Children played in courtyards, artisans carved ivory, combs, merchants haggled loudly over dates and grains. The contrast between ordinary life and impending doom must have been dizzying. Imagine sipping beer in a tavern while knowing an army camps a few miles away, quietly plotting your downfall. Belshazzar leaned on spectacle more than strategy. Records tell us of another feast, smaller than the infamous banquet, but still lavish, as if throwing parties could plug breaches in morale. He wanted to prove that the city was unshaken, but the laughter rang hollow, the toasts uncertain. Even the wine tasted bitter when drunk under the shadow of Persia. And then came the subtle signs of infiltration. Some Babylonian soldiers deserted at night, sneaking across to the Persian camp. Others were caught whispering doubts on watch duty. Cyrus did not need to storm the gates. Babylon was slowly opening them from the inside, one wavering heart at a time. By now, the once mighty empire looked less like a fortress and more like a stage set, dazzling from a distance but fragile when pressed. The Persians waited calmly, like hunters crouched in silence, knowing the trap was nearly ready to spring. The night the Persians finally made their move was quiet, so quiet that later storytellers swore the city seemed to be holding its breath. Babylon's guards leaned lazily on their spears, some half asleep, others distracted by the aftertaste of wine from Belshazzar's latest banquet. Behind those massive walls, people believed they were untouchable. After all, no army could scale such fortifications, and the gates were locked tight. But what they had not considered was the river. Cyrus's engineers had spent weeks diverting the Euphrates into a network of canals and marshes. Slowly, methodically, the river's depth fell, until, at last, it could be waded through. And so, under cover of darkness, Persian troops slipped into the city along the riverbed, water lapping at their knees, torches smothered, armor glinting faintly under the moon. It wasn't a heroic charge or a thunderous assault, it was a ghostly infiltration. The walls, so proud and impenetrable, had been bypassed without a single stone cracked. Babylon, for all its grandeur, had forgotten to secure the very path that sustained its life. Historians still debate whether the Babylonians simply underestimated this possibility or whether complacency had dulled their vigilance. But either way, the city's fate was sealed, not by force, but by neglect. Inside, life carried on. Musicians plucked lyres, guards joked at posts, bakers prepared loaves for morning markets. Somewhere, Belshazzar likely dreamed of another feast. The irony is almost comical. While the king slept, the Persians were literally walking into his empire. It was less epic battle and more awkward break-in, like leaving your door unlocked and finding strangers in your kitchen by dawn. Odd details cling to this night. One account claims dogs barked frantically as the Persians advanced, but their noise was drowned by festival music echoing from the palace. Another suggests some Babylonian guards, seeing figures in the river, assumed they were townsfolk sneaking out to fetch water and didn't bother to sound an alarm. Whether true or not, it paints the picture of a city so secure in its arrogance that it couldn't imagine danger until it stood at the threshold. By morning, Persian troops were spreading through the streets, securing gates and towers with little resistance. Some citizens awoke to the sight of foreign soldiers already patrolling, their banners unfurled. There was no cataclysm, no clash of titans, no thunder of battering rams, just the quiet realization that Babylon was no longer Babylon's. And where was Belshazzar? Later stories claim he was slain that very night, perhaps during a smaller feast, his confidence undone as suddenly as the writing on the wall had predicted. Others suggest he was captured first, paraded before Cyrus, and executed only after. Historians still debate which version is true, but what matters is that the city's ruler, so loud in boast and bravado, faded swiftly and without glory. The fall of Babylon was so anticlimactic that later generations almost struggled to make sense of it. How could a city of such might collapse without a massive battle? How could an empire so proud end in near silence? But that is often how history moves, not with fire and fury, but with a quiet shift, like the turning of a lock. And so, as dawn rose over the Euphrates, Babylon was no longer the jewel of Mesopotamia, but a prize in the hands of Persia. Its streets, once filled with laughter and arrogance, now echoed with the measured steps of foreign soldiers. The age of Babylon was over, and the world belonged to Cyrus. The fall of Babylon did not just shift power, it shook the very imagination of the ancient world. For centuries, the city had stood as the symbol of pride and splendor, a place where God supposedly favored mankind with walls so tall and gardens so lush that strangers swore it was paradise. And yet, in one night, all of that came crumbling down, not with flames or rubble, but with the quiet slip of soldiers through a half-drained river. When news of the conquest spread across Mesopotamia, it traveled faster than the Euphrates itself. Traders carried whispers of Cyrus's cunning, priests muttered about the will of the gods, and kings in faraway lands suddenly shifted uncomfortably on their thrones. If Babylon, with its colossal defenses and eternal arrogance, could fall so easily, what city was truly safe? The Persians wasted no time in reshaping the narrative. Cyrus, careful as ever with his image, presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He declared that Marduk, Babylon's chief god, had abandoned the city's rulers and chosen him instead. It was brilliant politics, stealing not only Babylon's stones but also its sacred heart. To the Babylonians, weary of their arrogant monarchy, the change felt less like invasion and more like divine correction. At least, that's how the official inscriptions would have you believe. Yet, beneath the gilded proclamations, daily life took on a strange duality. Farmers still tilled their fields, merchants still haggled in bazaars, women still wove garments in courtyards. But behind every transaction was the quiet knowledge that the empire's crown had shifted. Soldiers with foreign accents patrolled the gates, scribes recorded laws under a new banner, and offerings at temples were made in the name of a new overlord. Historians still debate how smoothly this transition truly went. Some accounts suggest that the Babylonians, tired of Belshazzar's extravagance and Nabonidus's strange religious policies, actually welcomed Cyrus. Others argue there must have been resistance, small sparks of rebellion in the outer provinces. After all, no empire changes hands without someone kicking up dust. But the remarkable truth is that Babylon remained intact. Its walls stood, its temples thrived, and unlike so many conquests, its people were not slaughtered wholesale. Cyrus was too clever to waste the jewel he had acquired. Still, there were odd moments. One story claims that when Persian soldiers entered the city, they were astonished by the sheer size of Babylon's avenues and palaces. Used to the more rugged landscapes of their homeland, they supposedly wandered in awe, muttering that no human hands could have built such a place. Another tale insists that some Babylonians barely noticed the conquest at first, assuming that Soldiers on the streets were simply mercenaries in the king's employ. Imagine waking up, fetching bread, and only later realizing that your entire empire had changed hands overnight. And of course, there were jokes whispered in taverns. One popular quip no doubt exaggerated mocked Belshazzar for throwing his grand feast while Cyrus threw a better party with the Euphrates. History has its dark humor, and Babylonians, like us, couldn't resist making light of their misfortunes. But while the common people adjusted, the wider world took the lesson differently. Kings in Egypt, Greece, and even the distant Indus Valley saw the fall of Babylon as a turning of the cosmic wheel. If the greatest empire of the age could collapse so quietly, what did that mean for their own rule? Envoys began drafting new treaties. Rebels in far-off corners dared to dream of independence, and philosophers mused that no wall, no matter how high, could stand forever. The fall of Babylon was not merely the loss of a city, it was the shattering of an illusion. For centuries, it had been the unmovable center, the unassailable jewel of the Fertile Crescent. And then, almost overnight, it became a trophy, absorbed into something larger, its pride bent into service of another crown. And so, as Babylon's people lit their lamps at dusk, the skyline still glittered with temples and palaces. The air still smelled of baked bread and incense. But beneath that familiar surface, a new current had begun to flow, a current that would carry the ancient world into a new chapter under the shadow of Persia. Cyrus did not simply claim Babylon, he reshaped it into a pillar of his empire. Where conquerors before him had raised cities to prove dominance, Cyrus preferred to stitch them into his growing tapestry. Babylon became a jewel, not crushed but polished, a crown he wore proudly to signal his legitimacy. And oh, what a crown it was! Almost immediately, he issued what would later be immortalized as the Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact etched with words that sounded suspiciously like political propaganda disguised as divine mission. In it, he claimed that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule, restoring justice and setting free those oppressed by Babylonian kings. To modern ears, it almost reads like a press release, complete with divine endorsement. One could almost imagine ancient scribes debating, should we lead with the gods' approval or the humanitarian reforms? What set Cyrus apart was how he backed up those words. Unlike many conquerors, he didn't force his gods onto others. In fact, he allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild their temples, and restore their rituals. For the Jewish community, long captive in Babylon, this was nothing short of miraculous. Freed to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct their temple, they saw Cyrus as not just a king but almost a messianic figure. Historians still debate whether Cyrus himself cared deeply about theology or simply understood that happy priests make obedient subjects. Either way, the strategy worked wonders. Life inside Babylon began to take on a new rhythm. Persian administrators walked its streets, blending into the urban hum. The markets bustled as always, but alongside Babylonian textiles and Mesopotamian grain, new goods began to appear: Persian rugs, Eastern spices, and the occasional exotic beast. Imagine going to buy barley and finding a camel for sale beside it. Talk about variety. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Babylonian elites, especially those who had thrived under Nabonidus, suddenly found themselves navigating a new political landscape. One week they were hosting feasts in palaces, the next they were carefully wording petitions to Persian governors. The scribes had the hardest time. Just when they had mastered writing decrees in the name of Nabonidus, they now had to start every document with titles like Cyrus, King of Kings, King of the Four Corners of the World. The titles alone could fill half a tablet. Yet despite the upheaval, the transition was smoother than most. Unlike Alexander's later fiery entry or countless sackings in history, Babylon's temples remained intact, its walls untouched, its scholars unscathed. Some even argue that Babylon flourished under Persian rule, becoming one of the empire's key administrative centers. The Persians, practical as ever, recognized that a city with functioning infrastructure and loyal subjects was far more useful than one reduced to rubble. There were still strange episodes that spiced up this period. One record suggests that Cyrus paraded through the city with lions at his side, a spectacle equal parts terrifying and theatrical. Another insists that Babylonian astronomers, used to charting the stars for their own kings, began predicting omens for Cyrus, though whether those predictions were accurate or simply flattering remains a mystery. After all, if the new ruler asks whether the heavens favor him, you don't exactly reply, not so much. Humor did not vanish from daily life either. In the taverns, locals joked that the Euphrates had become the greatest general of the campaign. Others quipped that the city's famed astrologers must have been too busy reading their horoscopes to notice an army sneaking into town. Human resilience often shows itself in laughter, even when thrones tumble and empires change hands. The global ripples of Cyrus's policies were enormous. Egypt began to prepare for the inevitable clash, knowing that Persia's gaze would eventually turn toward the Nile. The Greek city-states, too busy bickering among themselves, nevertheless took note of the rising colossus to the east. And in the lands once ruled by Babylon, smaller kingdoms adjusted their loyalties, sending tribute to the Persians before they had a chance to ask. And so Babylon, once a haughty mistress of empires, found itself transformed into a dutiful partner of a greater power. Its walls, gardens, and temples still stood, shimmering under the sun. But now they bore witness to Persian banners fluttering overhead. The fall of Babylon had not erased the city, but instead folded it into a story even larger, one that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. In the end, Cyrus's genius was not just in winning battles, but in winning hearts, or at least in convincing people that their hearts had already chosen him. And so, Babylon became not the grave of an empire, but the foundation of a new one. With Babylon firmly under his control, Cyrus had accomplished something extraordinary. He had not only taken a city, he had redefined empire itself. Yet the story of Babylon after its fall was not one of quiet assimilation alone. It became a stage for new tensions, new experiments in governance, and a reminder that even the greatest conquerors must play a careful game when ruling over conquered peoples. The Persian administrators, who settled into Babylon quickly, realized that this was no ordinary city. It was not a frontier outpost, nor a provincial town. It was the beating heart of Mesopotamia, with layers of tradition older than most empires on earth. Temples that claimed legitimacy from gods older than Zeus or Jupiter still held sway. Priests wielded influence equal to generals. A misplaced decree here could spark not just grumbling, but holy outrage. Cyrus, shrewd as ever, tread lightly. He appointed satraps, Persian governors, loyal to him, but he left much of Babylon's internal administration intact. This balance gave the appearance of continuity, while quietly shifting power into Persian hands. Taxes flowed smoothly, trade routes buzzed, and the city's scribes dutifully recorded the new order in cuneiform on clay tablets. Some even experimented with writing in Aramaic, a language rising in prominence across the empire. Though one suspects more than a few complained about learning yet another script. Imagine ancient bureaucrats grumbling the same way modern office workers gripe about new software, but beneath the smooth surface, tension lingered. Babylon had always seen itself as the center of the world, the axis around which all else turned. To suddenly play second fiddle to Persepolis or Susa bruised its pride. Some citizens whispered that the Persians were merely caretakers, that one day Babylon would rise again as the true capital of civilization. Historians still debate whether these whispers ever took organized form, but the seeds of discontent were there. Daily life reflected this blend of continuity and change. Farmers still brought dates, barley and sesame into the markets, but now, alongside them came Persian officials inspecting weights and measures. Craftsmen carved both Babylonian deities and Persian symbols, hedging their bets on which gods would pay better. In the evenings, storytellers entertained crowds with tales of Gilgamesh, though some slipped in jokes about Persian accents or satraps who didn't understand local customs. Humor, as always, became a quiet form of resistance. One particularly strange story tells of Babylonian priests deliberately mispronouncing Cyrus's titles during rituals, insisting that if the gods didn't recognize the words, the Persians couldn't claim true legitimacy. Whether or not this was common practice, it paints a vivid picture of how deeply intertwined language, faith, and politics were in this era. Another tale insists that a group of Persians attempted to transplant their beloved gardens into Babylon, but found the city's soil and water system so advanced that even they marveled, saying, "Perhaps the gods themselves live here." Not bad, considering these were the same Persians who had just conquered it. Cyrus, for his part, remained pragmatic. He respected Babylon but did not idolize it. To him, it was a powerful jewel in his crown, not the crown itself. When he marched east to continue expanding his empire, he left Babylon secure but not supreme. The city was a hub, a treasure, but no longer the master of the ancient world. Outside its walls, other nations reacted nervously. Egypt braced for confrontation, building armies and fortresses along the Nile. Greek envoys arrived, some curious, some cautious, trying to gauge just how unstoppable the Persians were. And in distant lands, rumors grew that Babylon itself had not truly fallen, that it was merely sleeping, biding its time to reclaim glory. Such was the weight of its legend, that and yet, despite its lost throne, Babylon continued to shine. Its scholars kept charting the heavens, producing astronomical records so detailed that even modern scientists marvel at their precision. Its temples still thrummed with activity, offering sacrifices not only to Babylonian gods but now to deities across the empire, creating a spiritual melting pot rare in the ancient world. In this strange balance of pride and subservience, Babylon endured, its people adapted, its streets remained lively, and its reputation as the gate of the gods survived, even as Persian banners fluttered above its gates. The city had been conquered, but it was not crushed. Instead, it lived on, changed, humbled, but still magnificent. And perhaps, deep down, the Babylonians knew something the Persians had yet to realize, that no empire lasts forever, and that someday, the wheel of history would turn again. By the time Babylon settled into its new role within the Persian Empire, it had already survived more upheavals than most cities could endure. But survival is not the same as supremacy, and Babylon's days of ruling the ancient world outright were gone. Instead, the city became a paradox, still dazzling, still mighty, yet no longer the undisputed center of power. The Persians, pragmatic rulers, continued to invest in Babylon. They understood its value as a hub of trade, culture, and religious prestige. Its canals carried grain and goods across Mesopotamia. Its markets overflowed with luxuries from India, Arabia, and beyond, and its temples hummed with prayers offered in half a dozen languages. To visit Babylon during this era was to step into the beating heart of a multicultural empire. Yet beneath the grandeur, an unease lingered. Babylonian priests, once unquestioned arbiters of cosmic legitimacy, now had to share their authority with Persian rulers who invoked foreign gods and foreign traditions. Imagine a proud Babylonian scholar forced to explain Marduk to a Persian general, while politely ignoring that the general thought Ahura Mazda was in charge. These theological debates weren't just abstract, they were political, shaping how people perceived who truly had the god's blessing. And then there was the question of identity. Was Babylon still Babylon if its kings no longer sat on the throne? Was it still the gate of the gods if its temples bowed to Persian decrees? Some citizens clung fiercely to their traditions, keeping the old rituals alive in private homes. Others embraced the Persian way, seeing opportunity in aligning with the empire's new masters. The city became a mosaic of loyalties, each piece glittering but never entirely fitting together. Strange episodes colored this transition. One story claims that Babylonian astronomers deliberately recorded omens predicting long reigns for heirs, not because they believed it, but because it ensured better temple funding. Another tale insists that Babylonian musicians played Persian songs in the marketplace, adding their own twists, until the Persians didn't recognize them at all. Call it the ancient world's version of satire, through remix. Despite these quirks, Babylon retained its aura of invincibility in the imagination of outsiders. Foreign envoys who walked its streets marveled at the vastness of its walls, the abundance of its gardens, and the precision of its canals. To them, even a conquered Babylon seemed more impressive than any city they had ever seen. It was as though the city itself refused to acknowledge defeat, continuing to dazzle long after its crown had been taken. Yet, for all its resilience, cracks had begun to show. The once proud claim that Babylon will never fall had already been disproven, and with that fall came a shift in psychology. Some Babylonians grew pragmatic, focusing on survival and prosperity under Persian rule. Others whispered prophecies of revival, convinced that the city's destiny was not yet finished. Historians still debate whether these prophecies were genuine hopes or simply coping mechanisms. Meanwhile, the wider world adjusted to the new order. Egypt, restless as ever, eyed Persia with suspicion, preparing for the inevitable clash. The Greeks, hearing tales of Persia's reach, began to weave their own legends of East and West, planting seeds of conflicts that would come centuries later. And in all these stories, Babylon lingered as both a cautionary tale and a warning that no empire was unshakable, but also that greatness could endure even in subjugation. And so, Babylon in this age was both shadow and light. Its streets still bustled, its scholars still charted the heavens, and its name still carried awe across continents. But deep down, the city was no longer the master of its destiny. It had become a jewel in someone else's crown, brilliant yet bound still. When night fell over its mighty walls and the Euphrates shimmered under moonlight, it wasn't hard to imagine the old glory. To a traveler arriving at dusk, Babylon still looked like the eternal city, a place too magnificent to ever fade, and perhaps, in a way, that illusion was its greatest survival. The story of Babylon's fall, and what followed, was not a tale of fire and ash, but of transformation. The city that had once defied the world did not vanish into ruins overnight. Instead, it learned the art of survival under new masters. From Cyrus to his heirs, Babylon remained a jewel of the Persian Empire, sometimes polished, sometimes neglected, but never entirely forgotten. For the Persians, Babylon was too important to destroy. Its markets fed trade routes that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Its priests, when placated, could lend divine legitimacy to foreign kings. And its scholars, with their meticulous star charts and mathematical brilliance, contributed knowledge that would echo across civilizations. To erase Babylon would have been foolish. And so, the city endured, shining faintly like a star that refused to burn out. But endurance came at a price. Babylon no longer decided its fate. It was no longer the city that set the terms of empires, but the city that adapted to them. Foreign banners flew above its gates, foreign rulers dictated its laws, and foreign tongues mingled in its markets. Still, within its walls, the heartbeat of Babylon remained. Families shared meals, children played in courtyards, lovers carved names into bricks, and elders told stories of a time when their city had been the center of the world. Historians still debate whether Babylonians ever truly accepted their new role. Some evidence suggests smooth cooperation, while other records hint at rebellions and quiet defiance. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps Babylon, like all great cities, was too vast and too complex to be defined by a single reaction. It was proud and humbled, loyal and resentful, fading yet eternal all at once. There were odd details too, the kind history tends to preserve in whispers. One tale insists that Babylonian cooks began blending Persian and Mesopotamian recipes, creating feasts that baffled and delighted both peoples. Another claims that scribes, out of subtle mischief, sometimes forgot to list the Persian king's titles in full, as if to suggest that no matter how many names a conqueror took, Babylon itself was still the greater word. Yet, despite all its ironies and adaptations, Babylon's legacy did not end with conquest. Its myths, its science, its architecture, and even its cautionary fall shaped the civilizations that came after. Greece admired its wonders, Rome studied its laws, and generations of storytellers retold its glory and its downfall. Even centuries later, when Alexander the Great arrived, he saw Babylon not as a relic, but as a prize, a city whose very name still commanded awe. And so, as the curtain falls on this chapter of history, Babylon remains a paradox, conquered yet unconquerable. In memory, diminished yet eternal in imagination. Its fall was not just the end of an empire. It was a reminder that all human greatness, no matter how magnificent, rests on fragile foundations. And perhaps that is why we still tell its story. Now, before we end tonight, let us slow things down. The city lights dim in our imagination. The great walls of Babylon, once filled with shouting soldiers and bustling merchants, fall quiet. The Euphrates drifts calmly under the moon, carrying soft ripples that seem to whisper of centuries past. In the stillness, you can almost hear the footsteps of those who lived there long ago, farmers walking home, priests tending the last embers in the temple, children giggling as they chase one another through the courtyards. The air is warm, touched by the scent of baked bread and distant incense. Stars wheel overhead, just as Babylonian astronomers once charted them, a reminder that while empires rise and fall, the heavens remain steady and eternal. The city itself, though conquered, still feels alive, its spirit woven into the fabric of history, never truly extinguished. So let your breath slow now, matching the rhythm of that quiet river. Let your mind drift with the current, past walls and gardens, past temples and palaces, until all that remains is the gentle murmur of water under starlight. You are safe, surrounded by the echoes of a city that, even in its fall, reminds us of endurance and beauty. And with that, let the story fade, like the glow of lamps at night, leaving only peace, calm, and the comfort of sleep.